Hey, LifePixers! Hope you're having an awesome day. I am excited for today's episode, and I hope you are too. If there's something in this episode that you see that you like, and you see somebody else can go and benefit from it, please share it right away. Don't even waste 1 second. Right away, press the share button and send it to them, so that way you'll be helping them have an extraordinary relationship, and you'll be helping us reach our goal of 1 million downloads per episode by the end of 2025. Now, the reason why I am super excited for today's episode is because we are talking about neuroplasticity, as you know, because you read the title, right? But why do I care so much about neuroplasticity? Because I work with neuroplasticity every single day. Each one of the Rewire Your Brain episodes is working on your neuroplasticity. What is neuroplasticity? How does it affect your marriage? We are going to answer all those questions in this episode. I am excited because today's guest is the co-founder of Reorigin, who got involved in neuroplasticity after having some major own situations. I'll let him tell you the story, okay? And now works with neuroplasticity to help people recover each and every day, but in a completely different way than I do. So I'll just show you and give you another perspective of what it's like to rewire your brain from another angle. Ready? If you want to learn more about Ben, who is our guest today, Ben Ahrens, you could go to reorigins.com, okay? And thank you so much, Ben, for being here. I am excited to be speaking with you. You want to start by telling us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about how you got involved in what you do.
Yeah, sure. So thank you, first of all, for having me. Pleasure to be here. And I got started early on in life, just really fascinated with the idea of change, that we could actually implement some changes in our lives. And for me, it started when I was really young, like young teenager, fascinated by this idea of being able to work out and change the shape of my body, right? So like being a scrawny kid, this is one of the things most boys think about in school is like, how can I, buff up, change my appearance, change my way of being in the world. And I just became more and more fascinated with this idea that we can go from having an idea in our head to do some sort of action and then create a physical change. And that fascination grew into a health and fitness career. I was an athlete as well as a trainer. I trained other athletes and helped people recover from injuries. And then in my mid-20s, I actually got really sick. I lost my own health. And it was a combination of parasites that I picked up while traveling, combined with Lyme disease and a host of other things. But essentially, short of it is I was bedbound for about 3 years and found myself really struggling to get my health and life back. And throughout that process, I learned about the brain and how the brain can put out these outsized or oversized responses to certain triggers, and how we can actually, once again, kind of like exercise, we can actually interject and intervene in our own subconscious and neurological processes to change our stress response. So that ended up being what had the biggest impact on me, is learning how to change my stress response so that I could stop perpetuating the inflammatory cycles that were contributing to the condition, and I could ultimately and eventually heal from that condition.
Okay, so just take me back to those times. How old were you then? What were you doing until you got stuck in bed? And how did you spend your days?
Good questions. So I was about 25 when I really started to get sick. And prior to that, I was traveling in the winter and surfing and competing in some contests, mostly surfing for fun. And in the summers, I was running a surf camp in the East End of Long Island. And I was training athletes in various facilities in Manhattan and out east in Long Island. And so I was very, very active.
Out all the time. You went to the extreme opposite.
Constantly. And, it's interesting that sometimes the thing we fear most, in my case, losing my physicality, losing my health, is sometimes the thing that life gives you to kind of test you or help you to discover other passions and powers that you may have dormant. So for me, yes, I was very physically active, very busy. And the hardest thing was going from that to literally within a few weeks, just deteriorating further and further downward. And I gave a short, about 8-minute TED talk about this experience, to being bedbound and being unable to walk most days. On days when I could walk, it would usually require sometimes a couple of weeks of recovery, staying in bed. I had arthritis in my in all of my joints, bone on bone arthritis in the knees and elbows. I had brain lesions and intense brain fog, migrating pains, whole host of symptoms associated with what we sort of know are these mysterious illnesses like chronic Lyme disease, but perhaps the most prominent, fibromyalgia, brain fog, and absolute exhaustion. So going from, high energy output to literally having no energy was a challenge. You asked how I spent my days. For a long time, I spent my days just first trying to recover, thinking at first that maybe this was just mono or my body fighting something off and it just needed rest. So at first, I think we all have somewhat of a tolerance for spending some time in bed. But when that persisted, it shifted a little bit more toward a panic mode. I was doing a lot of research, which is very common for people in that scenario, trying to fix and find answers and solutions to my problem. And that research
more problems.
creating more, exactly. Yes. Creating more problems, because engaging in that type of research from a place of fear, as you know, can contribute to all of that inflammation and make matters worse, especially when there's no clear answers in sight. It can just really spin you for a loop. So that was, I would say 18 months of really going down that path, finding, little tidbits, strings to pull at, strands of hope, go down a certain path. After 4 to 6 weeks, turns out to be a dead end, turn around, go the other way, see a different doctor, try a different approach, and got caught in that unfortunately common scenario for a lot of people who suffer from mysterious illnesses of just jumping from one approach to the next and not really making any forward progress. And it got down to a point where I could no longer even read because the cognitive symptoms got bad. So I listened to a lot of podcasts at the time. And this was, 10 years ago, a little bit more than 10 years ago now. So podcasts were
new then.
Brand new. Yeah. Tons of new stuff to discover. UC Berkeley and MIT were putting some of their 1 and 200 level courses online. So I jumped into some neuroscience courses and, never had a formal education in it, but I started piecemealing together these different aspects of the stress response, the inflammatory cycles, and how we may be able to shift that using this sort of targeted neuroplasticity, which is ultimately what I ended up doing little by little, but ended up having profound impacts. And now, just so the listeners know, it's been 10 years and I'm completely healthy and have been for many, many years. And, it was a real awakening when I started to feel and experience the benefits just by implementing what are relatively simple neurocognitive exercises.
So what was the thing that helped you find that neuroplasticity that made you realize like, oh, this is what's really going to help me? I
think what drew my attention toward at least asking those questions or trying to figure out or even ask, prompt me to kind of look that the problem might be in the brain was I realized that my perception was not lining up with reality. So by that, I mean, it surprised me that if I, let's say, got out of bed and tried to exert myself, that I could actually exert myself. I could actually lift something that felt impossible to lift. It was the perception of it. It was the amount of energy it took. And I remember reading this study or somewhere it said something to the effect of, if you pull like an all-nighter, or let's say you pull 2 all-nighters, right? So like 48 hours, no sleep, and you go into the gym, then you will probably be able to only move about half as much weight if you're lucky as you normally would. Now, what caught my interest was the reason behind that. So in 48 hours, it's not the case that you've lost 50% of your muscle mass, right? What you've lost is temporarily your ability, your nervous system's ability to connect with your muscle patterns and your movement and to recruit muscle fibers to produce force. And when I read that, I remember thinking, this has to be going on in me. Like, I'm 25, it can't be the case that all of a sudden I went from this crazy athletic lifestyle to like losing all of my faculties and strength, even though that's what it seemed like. So the problem had to be some link between how the brain was interacting with my body. And the further down that path I went, the more it just seemed to make sense. And it also made a lot of caused me to become hopeful, because I also read some of these studies that like Norman Doidge brought to light about people who were able to increase, let's say, their strength using just visualization alone, using just ways of connecting or resynchronizing the nervous system with the body. And so I would say it kind of made intuitive sense. And I started to practice some of these and see, results little by little, and realize that, yes, it must be this sort of perceptual problem, not only the physical problems.
So cool. So cool. I like how you found it and you like went into it. You're like, hey, this is not just like, oh, a random article, but there is like something deeper here. So I want to take a step back now, and I want to hear your own personal definition of neuroplasticity.
Yeah, good question. So my definition of neuroplasticity is your brain's natural ability to change its structure and function. And it does that by a process of pruning and unmasking. So it's a simple kind of two step process, whereby the first step is decoupling and destroying old neural pathways. And the second step would be building new neural pathways. So that's kind of a neurological or nervous system definition of neuroplasticity. Now, the more general definition I would give is that it's anyone's natural ability to change their own responses.
Yeah. I don't know if I use those exact words, but more like how you could just like change your brain to do something differently and to be wired differently.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, to be wired differently, I think, is the key, because it is about, changing your brain in such a way where your responses change as a result of that. So you don't need to think about a different response. Let's just say, a good example might be a flinch response, right? If someone is a catcher in baseball, something that really wouldn't support them in that activity would be a flinch response, meaning every time a ball comes their way, they flinch and duck and throw their arms in front of their face, because they need to keep their eye on the ball. They have to be engaged. So through the mechanisms of neuroplasticity, they can train a different response. They can train themselves to keep their eyes open, to keep calm, to breathe, to relax, and to ultimately keep their eye on the ball, because that would help their activity. So the cool thing about neuroplasticity is once this rewiring is done, you don't have to think about it every time. You don't have to, like, every time the fastball comes your way, think, oh, wait, no, this time I gotta, keep my arms by my side. I gotta breathe, all these things. If you've trained it properly, then those new neural pathways and movement pathways in this case would be kind of locked in.
Yeah. Okay. Now I'm asking you this question, more like, because I'm curious to hear how you experience it versus I do. Like, I could give an answer if you want afterwards, but
please.
What do you think is the biggest, like the thing people disbelieve most, like the biggest objection people have, like, to neuroplasticity from your experience?
I think it's somewhat held over to the fixed mindset and the old research that said that we were born with 86 billion neurons and that those neurons are just being depleted from the moment we're born. And in a way, it's from a mechanical view, it kind of mirrors our experience of life, that things are fixed. If you look at anything physical, any physical object, it starts off a certain way, and mechanical object, and it deteriorates over time. That's just kind of the nature of things. But when it comes to the human brain and body, I think Nicholas Taleb put it really well when he coined this new term called antifragile or antifragility, right? Which is that the brain and the human being ultimately is one of the very few things in the universe which has this characteristic of actually gaining resilience and improving the more subtle stress you subject it to. So the example he gives is that, if you drop a glass plate on the floor and it breaks, that's fragile. We all know what that is. If you drop a plastic plate and it doesn't break, we could say that's resilient. It just, it stays the same, or maybe gets a little ding here and there, but it's okay. What if you had a plate where every time you dropped it, it actually got stronger? It's like, well, that's what the human brain is. Every time you subject it to these changes, to a little bit of stress in the right way, it actually grows a denser network. It increases neurogenesis, builds new neurons, new connections, and gets stronger.
Yeah. Totally on for that one. And anti-fragile. I love it. My favorite part about it is that there's no word for it.
That's great. I love how he had to actually, yes, invent a new word. I wonder if it's made it into the dictionary. I hope so.
Yeah. For me personally, whenever I hear people say that, which I get a lot, I don't know if as much as you, but I think I find it really interesting because for me, what I do, like Feuerstein and rewinding the brain and stuff, like now I do it as clients, but as a kid, I got it. So neuroplasticity and like changing your brain was always a part of my life. Like it was never something that I never thought was possible. And then like I started working in this and I see people actually live in the old age and they're not really agreeing with this, and I have to try to help them, show them that we know so much more and so much different things today.
Yeah. Where do you think that position comes from, or what is it in, maybe it's in all of us, that we cling to this idea of things being fixed, things being not able to change?
Yeah. So for sure, some of it comes from like that past, like of so-called science. I mean, science, this is my problem with science. Like I love it. It's so cool, but at the same time, it's always wrong because it's always changing and growing. So if you're not like, even what I'm saying today might be wrong because they might find out something new tomorrow or the next year. And it's be like, hey, I taught that wrong thing. And I was like, okay, that was the best science that there was. So there is some of that. But I think also, I wonder, I don't know, but maybe some of it comes from fear. People are like, oh, actually now I have to change, or I could change, and what's going to be? And this is scary.
Yeah. I agree. I think it can be a little bit daunting because it is a responsibility, right? If you couldn't do anything about it, well, there's no responsibility involved there. But once you realize that you can actually change these mechanisms on a pretty fundamental level, you have to take a little bit of ownership of that. And I certainly remember in my own experience, it was quite humbling, to realize that. It's like, on the one hand, it's hopeful, it's great, like, oh wow, I'm not stuck in this position. On the other hand, it's like, oh, okay, now it's up to me to do this.
That is what I love about the concept of 100% responsibility. It's like you can't blame anyone else, but at the same time, you have the power to go and do anything now because it's your responsibility. Okay, so let's say someone wants to take this concept of neuroplasticity, of rewiring their brain, into improving their marriage. Okay, the marriage is good. They see there are some habits, some of the ways they're acting that they want to change, and they've tried some things in the past, but for some reason it's not working, and they now want to change that.
So I think this is actually really compatible with marriage and relationships in general, because if controlling or learning how to modulate your own responses can have such a huge outsized impact on your own health, then imagine when you throw a second person in the mix, and now you have this like dynamic, this relationship where one person can trigger another person. And so I think it becomes, in a way, even more important to be able to modulate your own responses. And I like to think of neuroplasticity, like the action of doing neuroplasticity, as having three components to it. The first one is recognizing, a sort of just like awareness, becoming aware that you do have a certain loop, a certain trigger, and a certain response that happens subconsciously. So it's bringing that subconscious response to conscious light. Could be, if your spouse says a certain thing or has a certain tone, could be if it's a certain time of day, whatever it might be. But we all have these little, ways that we respond, however subtle. The second step,
awareness. I always say everything starts with self-awareness.
it starts with awareness. I heard this saying once that said, mindfulness is easy, but remembering to be mindful is hard. Yeah. So the same thing is true here, right? It's like the awareness is so critical, and it's not hard to be aware. It just, you got to be aware that you're not aware at first.
Right. Okay. So that's number one.
So number one is the awareness. Number two is interjecting or interrupting the pattern. So now that you're aware that you're having this, response, every time my spouse, looks at me that way or says that thing, I get defensive and shut down and triggered. So once you become aware of that, the second is to interject in that. And this is it can be really an internal practice. The way we do it in Reorigin, which is the company I have now to help people retrain their brains for chronic conditions, is using the mind, the body, language, all of these different faculties that we have available to us to communicate essentially a new message to the limbic system.
So could you give us some examples of that?
Yeah, sure. So we're on this second step right now, which is pattern interruption, right? So we can try one right now. Actually, I'll invite everyone listening to try this. So I want you to just become aware of anything over the past, let's say, day or 2 days that might have troubled you, right? That's to say anything that's given you a feeling that's less than pleasant. And if you kind of take a moment, just imagine yourself there and feel what that starts to do in your body. Now, right away, I want you to lean back, put your shoulders back, put your hands up, and just say the word pause.
Pause.
Okay. So that's one form of just interrupting. We've changed it by changing physiology. We've used a word that we all understand that means pause. And then we can take further steps from there. We can start to engage the intellect, and you can actually run a script or say something to yourself out loud or internally. That's something basically not acknowledging that what you're experiencing, what you're feeling, is just the result of chemicals in your system. All too often, we give so much credence and so much power to these feelings, these emotions that run through us. And sometimes the thing to do is to realize them for what they are, which is mere chemical compounds that are just running through the system. And once we see them for biochemistry for what they are, we can actually just kind of let go. And then just like caffeine, just like alcohol, just like any other substance in the system, they have a half-life, and that half-life will diminish fairly quickly. For anger, for emotions like a rage response, anger, it's usually less than 90 seconds. So if we can actually get ourselves to interject by saying something like pause, change our physiology, take a deep breath, smile, or even best yet, if you can, walk outside, change your environment. However, you can change that circumstance in the moment.
Yeah.
Movement, yeah, absolutely. Movement is great. In Reorigin, we talk a lot about the importance of mood elevation. We have like toolkits, that people can do involving movement, listening to music, you name it. All of these different things that essentially help you to come back to this baseline, so that whatever you're experiencing in the form of that emotion or that chemical response can just circulate through the system, and you can be done with it.
Yeah. Okay. So that's for pause. Okay. So we broke our pattern. This, I'm going to guess, going back to what you said earlier about what neuroplasticity is. This was the destroying the neuropaths part, right?
Correct. Exactly.
Okay, so now we have to build our new neuron connection.
Now we gotta build the one that we want, right? This is the fun part, because now in that pause that we just made, we inserted this space. And, famed psychologist Viktor Frankl said, between stimulus and response, there's a gap or a space. And in that space lies our freedom to choose our own attitude or to choose our own response. So once we've created that space, now we have this wiggle room in which we can insert whatever feeling or response we want to have. So, let's say for a moment that your spouse asks you, how was your day? And for whatever reason, whatever past experience you had, whatever, condition or association you may have formed, you take that question as a challenge, as if like maybe you didn't work hard enough that day, or maybe she's demanding something extra of you, or he or whoever might be. And for whatever reason, you might not even know what the reason is, but let's just say whenever you hear this question from your spouse, it has this reaction within you. So if your goal is to not have that response and to enhance or improve your relationship, what you could do is you could practice this either with or without your spouse, probably without at first, but you could practice, just visualize that you are receiving that question. And when you start to feel those same old emotions of frustration of being judged, or I'm being asked, what did I get done today, or whatever you think it is, that's when you do that pause, take a little break and do something to elevate your mood. Go outside, like you said, move your body. And now what you can do is build the new response. So let's say if the response you want to have is to really relax and to smile at your spouse, that's something that you can actually practice in real time. I mean, practice in real time in your mind. And by rehearsing that, by mentally rehearsing that, the same way the catcher mentally rehearses not flinching when the ball comes his way, practices a more relaxed and engaged response, you can actually change the response when it comes to the real event. So by doing this, through mental rehearsal over and over again, the next time that your spouse asks you, how was your day? Instead, what you might find is that you might all of a sudden relax, a smile can come to your face, and you might feel appreciative that, this person is asking you, like really is genuinely curious how your day was, instead of, oh, this person is just judging me again that I didn't get enough done today, or something like that.
Right. Okay. So when you say practice, do you mean just visualizing, or like literally having like these practice runs, or what do you mean exactly by that?
Yeah, really great question. So one of the things that we talk a lot about in Reorigin, again, this is really pertaining to people who are trying to come back from severe limbic system impairments or chronic health conditions, is this idea of gradual exposure. And in psychology, this is known as gradual exposure therapy or incremental training. But it's a step-by-step approach where everyone has to kind of gauge where they should begin. And for most people, you don't begin in the most intense scenario, right? You don't begin while you're having the argument or the conversation or the event. You begin a little bit at a distance from it, in a place where you know that you're safe, where you can control the speed and the tempo and the variables. And so for most people, that tends to be in the mind. So you can start off with visualizing it. Then perhaps the next step is you can take a picture of the person or the circumstance that might trigger you. And so you make it a little bit more real, a little bit more tangible. And then if, depending on the type of relationship you have with the person, if they are assuming they are the trigger in that scenario, you can tell them, hey, like, you know what, I realize that there's two sides to this. There's the situation, but there's also my response to the situation. And you can just engage them in a little bit of a game and practice it with them and say, I'm practicing, or I want to try changing my response. Let's see if this stuff works. And you can have them kind of play a role, or play that role. And you can kind of do some dress rehearsals.
And it's interesting you're saying that. Literally just the episode before this episode, we were speaking about just the opposite of going from like concrete to abstract. So here it's like you're going more abstract to going more far away, not so close, not so scary to the situation, and then coming closer to the actual concrete pattern that you want to go and create. But hopefully by that time it's not scary anymore, because you created this new awesome pattern in
Exactly.
your brain.
Yeah, exactly. That's really the basis of it, is to take these small, more calculated steps so that you don't experience that sense of overwhelm. The same way that, like you said, by the time you get to the real thing, it's not that scary anymore. Yeah.
Now, okay, again, I love asking these like double advocate questions, because like hearing them from another perspective, someone who like believes just like me, then what do you say? Like, how long do you think these changes last for?
So here's the cool part. I think that these changes are permanent. So from everything that I have researched and experienced myself, the coolest thing about this type of neuroplasticity is that these changes are so fundamental that they really are in some way kind of undoing the basis of the problem or the challenge that we were experiencing before. Now, I'll caveat that by saying, of course, if we go back to an old circumstance, right, where we're re-triggered or we're re-exposed to a certain trauma over and over again, that too is conditioning, and we can be
Your brain
conditioned
is
back
wired
again.
again.
So it's essentially neuroplasticity is intact. Like your brain is still changing like it's supposed to. It just it changes to whatever you expose it to most frequently.
Yeah, exactly. I always say like your brain is either going up or down. So are you changing it to like, are you growing those connections in a way that work for you or against you? So totally.
Yes.
And that's why I think like thing that people dislike the most about this is how long it takes to actually create those new patterns. Yeah, there are different things that like could rush it up, but it's not like you just like take a pill and like everything is rewired for you, right? And because it is so changed at like on a cellular level, like things are literally changed inside of your brain. It's like you can't expect it. Like just like you don't grow muscle overnight, like your brain's not just growing new patterns like that overnight.
I always say that's a good analogy is, exercise. It's like, it's not the kind of thing where you go into the gym once and you do the workout and then you look in the mirror and you say, well, that didn't work. It's like, well, we all know intuitively, no, this is consistency is of the essence. It's a practice that goes on. The one difference that I think holds true when it comes to this type of neuroplasticity that we're talking about versus something like exercise is that, let's say, if you're trying to increase strength or maintain a certain amount of strength in the gym or endurance or whatever it might be, physical attribute, there is this thing called the SAID principle, which is specific adaptation to impose demand. Basically says that your body will change to whatever demands you place on it. And if you stop placing those demands on it, it will change back. So right? So here's the difference though with neuroplasticity is that when it comes to rewiring these pathways that we're talking about, what we're talking about are maladaptive responses. They're inappropriate responses or outsized responses to relatively benign triggers. And so it's usually the case that those maladaptive responses formed due to some trauma or stress, whether known to us or unknown, whether from the outside or inside, whether from our own thoughts and experience or from pathogens or, injury from the environment or something. These are all essentially temporarily causing the brain to maladapt. And for that reason, I think, and everything that I've read and experienced supports that when you undo the basis of these issues, when you revert the brain back to its normal homeostatic function, that maintains itself. Again, unless you have some new issue come in and create another maladaptive response, then of course that has to be addressed as well.
That's like the coolest part about it. Like you do the work and then like it's there with you forever. So how has this own process of like neuroplasticity and doing your work and working with other people affect your own marriage?
Again, I think it comes back to empowerment. It's like knowing that it's that double-edged sword. I think what we were talking before of empowerment, but also responsibility, right? Knowing that when there are heated emotions, as of course there always will be in certain situations, but knowing that there are certain tools and relatively easy ways to come back to baseline that both my wife and I now use on a regular basis, so that we can kind of come back to whatever conflict may have arisen and address it from I don't know if this is a word, but from a place of same pageness, we'll call it.
Yeah.
Right? We're both kind of focused on the same goal. Because at the end of the day, whether it's working with colleagues or employees or your spouse or anything, at the end of the day, we're all people. I think we all want in some way the same thing, which is to feel peaceful, to feel happy. And for my wife and I know that oftentimes what we want is exactly the same thing. It's just sometimes we have different ways of going about getting it. And I'll give you an example of that. If you want a personal one, is different rhythms. I think every person has their own kind of tempo, rhythm, their way of working and doing things. My way of working, my rhythm is kind of slow. I'll say it's a little bit more thoughtful, pensive, thinking through all of the options, and then once all the options have been vetted, making decisions from there. My wife, on the other hand, is much more action oriented. She believes in just taking action and learning from doing. And sometimes that makes me kind of nervous because I'm like, wait a minute, but we haven't considered all these other options. Like, how can you know that just that action is the best one? And my responses make her a little bit nervous because she's like, what are you wasting all this time planning and thinking for? Let's just take action. We're wasting time. So that's been a huge learning experience, is how to respect each other's rhythms, but still, move forward. And I think the key, like I said, is sometimes just recognizing. A huge thing was, number one, recognizing that we have these different rhythms. And then number two, realizing that, hey, like where we want to get to is the same place. How can we kind of give each other the space, allow each other to feel heard and expressed while moving forward together?
I like that. I like that so much. Okay, so before we get to our final question, where could LifePixers connect with you and learn more about you?
Yeah, so the best place is just to go to my website, which is reorigin.com. That's actually re-origin.com. And there you can see some more stuff about neuroplasticity, like we're talking about here. You can also see a TED Talk that I gave in 2015, getting more into my own experience. Thank you. You can also email me directly from there. If anyone has questions, the contact form on that site goes directly to me.
Amazing. So we'll put those links in the show notes. And for our final question, one that is asked to everyone, is how would you describe an extraordinary relationship without using love, trust, or intimacy?
That's a great question. Extraordinary relationship without using love, trust, or intimacy. I will come back to the notion of health or homeostasis, which is that I really believe that homeostasis and health are the natural state. And I think that health can exist and persist not only within the individual, meaning this sense of harmony and well-being, and where every cell is communicating fluidly with every other cell, but health, of course, can exist within a relationship. So what I see as an extraordinary relationship would not be different to what I view as extraordinary health, which is this sense of fluid communication. It's not about getting your responses nailed down pat or perfect every time. There's always going to be, challenges and all sorts of, responses that don't make sense. But I think if we can learn to not tense up in relationship to another, that things can flow, communication can flow. We can feel at a sense of ease within ourselves and with each other. And I think that is an extraordinary feeling to have.
Total agreement to that. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ben. This was amazing and really interesting to get to hear someone else who works with neuroplasticity on a daily basis, but in such a different way than me. This was cool and this was fun. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. This was great.
That's all for this episode of the LifePix University podcast, but I have a huge favor to ask of you that will not only support the show, but will also help the people you love most. We are striving for 1 million downloads by the end of 2025, and we can't do this without your help. If you love this episode, please share it with 2 of your family and friends so they too can rewire their brains to have an extraordinary marriage. It was awesome spending time with you, and I'll see you on the next episode.